Hello everybody, my name's Zahir and I want to welcome you to my channel today, Plants and Paints, where we are going to be talking about the Philodendron Brasil, also known as the Philodendron Scandens, also the Philodendron Scandens Brasil. I'm sure it goes by a few other names, but I think I'll stick to that because it seems to be generally what it's known by. So I'm going to start off with a little introduction into the plant. It's not going to be much of an introduction because there's not much to talk about. And then we're going to move on to the care and maintenance. So let's get started. So the scientific name for this Philodendron Brasil is the Philodendron hederaceum. Philodendron hederaceum Brasil, and it can be found growing natively in Central and South America. Now this is a flowering plant from the Araceae family and is an evergreen hemipathitic climber which can grow anywhere from 3 to 6 meters in length, which, as you can imagine, that is quite a significant plant, a very huge plant to have in your collection. It has beautiful heart-shaped glossy leaves. Now these leaves can actually also grow very big. They actually get up to 30 centimeters in length. I don't have a 30 centimeter in length leaf to actually show you, but this is sort of the largest leaves that I have at the moment, and I would imagine they're sort of getting about halfway there. So really in a mature plant you're looking for the leaves to get to that sort of size. Mature plants are also known to produce spathes of white flowers. Now I have looked at pictures of the flowers on the internet and they are really quite beautiful and quite a large significant flower. Unfortunately I don't have an example to show you because my plant is not in flowering at the moment. I don't think it's quite mature enough to flower, but if by any miracle during this growing season I do end up with flowers, I will definitely take some pictures of those and post them up onto my Instagram account. But like I said, it's very unlikely that that's actually going to happen because I don't consider my plant to be a mature plant itself. So the Philodendron Brasil is a cultivar plant and can be easily found within the plant trade due to its ease of growth and very easy propagation. It's a very prolific growing plant and can fill a required space with very little effort or attention. So if you're looking for something to fill a gap in your home and you've got quite a big gap to fill, then this would be an ideal plant for you to consider having. Or if you've already got the plant and you're wondering where you want to put it and you're not quite sure of the growth pattern of the plant, then I just want to point out that this plant will fill a big space in no time at all. When I actually got the plant itself, it came in a little 12 centimeter pot and was just below the length of that pot, and most of the growing that this plant has done, which as you can see is quite a lot. This plant is actually sitting at about 4 foot in length at the moment. Most of this growing has been since the beginning of the growing season this year, so from, let's say, late May onwards, I would suggest. It's generally put on most of its size. So it's a cultivar plant and it can be very easily found in the trade, and the reason for that is, as I mentioned earlier, due to the fact that it's such a prolific grower and it's a very easy plant to propagate. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about propagating a bit later in the video, because the vote that I did for this video included taking cuttings, so fingers crossed, providing my video doesn't cut off before I get the chance to do that, I am going to try and fit how to do cuttings of this plant into this video as well. So as I was mentioning, it's quite a prolific growing plant, and if you've got a space that you want to fill, then ideally this plant is the kind of plant you want to be looking at if it's a plant that you're interested in. So the Philodendron Brasil has beautiful two-toned heart-shaped leaves, and the variegation on the leaves looks like it's been splattered onto the leaves. I mean, no two leaves are the same, so the pattern of the variegation in every leaf is going to be different to the last one that you were looking at. It's quite an interesting plant to look over. Actually, I can spend quite a lot of time actually looking over this plant, checking out the different variegation that it's got, because it differs so much. Like, just as an example, this leaf here, a lot of the variegation, you're generally going to find it to be like this. So the variegation is going to run through the center of the leaf, which is this really light green color in the center here. But also you're going to find it where it is going to spread itself out across the leaf. Now, as in this leaf here, you can see it's pretty much divided the variegation and the natural coloring of the leaf by 50-50 almost. And some of the leaves, like for instance these two leaves in the back here, I hope that's in the video, are almost fully variegated leaves with very little of the original coloration running just along the edge of the leaf here, and also the same on this leaf here. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while, about how to actually get heavier variegation on your leaves if that's something you want to achieve with your Philodendron Brasil. So I think I've given a good enough general introduction into the plant there. If I haven't covered anything in the general introduction that you would like to know, then please don't hesitate to put it in the comments. I'm always happy to answer questions, and I do love reading your comments, and you know, I generally will try to answer them in the same day, if not by the next day. So what we're going to do now, we're going to move on to the care and maintenance of the plant. So we're going to start off by talking about lighting. Now, the Philodendron Brasil can generally survive in a range of lighting conditions. So it can tolerate low light conditions, although this can somewhat have an effect on the growth pattern of the plant. So low lighting conditions, I just want to clarify that before I move into the description of it. Low lighting conditions doesn't mean that you can stick your plant in a dark corner where it's not receiving any light. That, you know, in no way, shape or form does it mean that. All plants generally require some form of light, and you know, they need that to help them photosynthesize so that they can keep growing and produce new growth. So low lighting just means somewhere where it is a low amount of light, just not no light. So don't think that you can put it in a passageway where there's no windows and you're just relying on your passage bulbs to produce light for the plant, because that's not going to be sufficient. You're going to end up with quite an unhealthy and very sparse looking plant, and I would be shocked to hear if it would even survive in that. Although saying that, this is a very forgiving and very easy to grow plant. So you can keep it in low lighting conditions, but as I mentioned, what the effect of that is the space between the internodes. Now on my plant here, you'll notice that the spacing between the internodes is consistent from one leaf to the next, and you can see that it's quite a lush looking plant as well. So a lot of the space in the plant, the leaves are actually overlapping from one internode to the next, where the leaves have got to a significant enough size. But if you're keeping it in quite a low lighting condition, then those gaps between the internodes are going to be extended. So you're going to end up with quite a leggy and sparse looking plant with not very much leaf growth happening on it, and not very lush looking. Now myself, as I'm sure you can tell, I do like to keep my plant looking as lush as possible. The majority of the time I had it, it was actually living in the window, but I moved it quite recently to my green wall, which is, you know, a meter or so away from my window, which is a north facing window, and it still seems to be quite happy. I've had it sitting there for over a month now, and I've had no adverse effects to the plant. It's producing new growth almost every other day at the moment, so you know, I'm assuming therefore it is quite happy. So to keep lush growth, what you want to do is you want to keep it in bright to medium indirect light. You don't want to stick it in like a south facing window or somewhere where it's getting direct sun. You want to keep it in an area where it's getting, if the sun was to travel in that direction, you want the plant to be off in that direction. You don't want it sitting where it's, you know, exposed to the rays of the sun, because it will actually end up burning the leaves and damaging the plant, and it generally will create quite an unhappy plant for you, possibly may even kill your plant. So bright to medium indirect light if you want it to grow quite lush and quite full like mine has grown. Um, so I think I've covered the lighting there in enough detail. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move on to the watering now. Sorry, so watering your philodendron. I would suggest water it well. That doesn't mean to obviously saturate the soil and leave it with excess water in it. If make sure that your pot that you keep your plant in has drainage holes. If you're keeping that pot inside a decorative pot, make sure that any drain off water is removed from the pot, because you don't want to let your plant live in a soggy environment. It can cause all kinds of complications, in particularly root rot, and it'll make your plant really quite unhappy to do that. So what you want to do, water it well, and then wait for about the soil to become about 50% dry. So once it's about 50% of the depth of the soil has gone dry, that will be the time to water it. And like I said, give it a good watering, but just don't over water the plant. If you've got excess water sitting at the bottom of the pot, make sure to get rid of that. Things that you will notice with the plant, if you're over watering it, then the leaves, once you get used to having the plant, you'll know when the leaves are dying in a natural way. They will yellow and they will die off, and you can remove them from the plant. But if you notice your leaves start dying very prematurely and yellowing very prematurely, then that generally is a sign of overwatering. And also with underwatering, if you notice your leaves going brown, so brown in color doesn't necessarily have to be crispy, but brown in color, because it can still contain some of the moisture, but they can also go crispy. So if you notice the leaves going a bit brown and starting to discolor in that way rather than turning yellow, then that generally is an indicator that you're underwatering the plant. I mean, I personally think, providing you follow the perimeters that I'm saying to you, is quite a difficult plant to get the watering wrong with. I think I've covered the watering there in quite enough detail. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to move on to the humidity. So due to the fact that this plant natively comes from Central and South America, you can imagine it lives in quite a hot, humid environment within its own surroundings. So it does like to be in a high humid environment, but this plant, I must say, is not a fussy plant. So you could keep it in your average household humidity. You don't necessarily have to have a humidifier. You don't even have to spray the plant regularly, although it does like it. And this plant will thrive well, providing you're giving it enough water and enough light. But obviously, the more humidity you provide the plant, the healthier the plant will be, the bigger the leaves will be, the more outstanding the variegation will be. So adding humidity in there as a factor is beneficial for you as the plant keeper, for what you're actually seeing in return from your plant. So generally in my house, in the evenings, once I've shut my door, my humidity goes up to about 75%, which is quite high. I do like to keep it quite high because I've got quite a lot of tropical rainforest plants in my house, and obviously they do love a high humid environment, and this coming from a similar environment as well is going to benefit from it. So ways to raise your humidity for the plant would be obviously using a humidifier. Now this plant currently is not really close to my humidifier, but as I mentioned, my living room can get up to 75% humidity over the evening, and that's throughout the whole living room. So it does get high humid periods of time. I would suggest that's anything from 12 to 14 hours in a day, but it lives probably about 10 to 12 foot away from my humidifier. Although that is quite far away, it still does get quite a lot of that humidity because it's on the other side of the door, and my humidifier is on this side and the plant lives on this side, and the humidifier generally is moving in that direction. So it is, regardless of the fact it's quite far away, it is getting quite a lot of that humidity. Now, other ways you can raise the humidity in your plant is by misting regularly. This plant does enjoy a regular misting. I mist this particular plant every morning. Other things you can do is, if you've got it in a pot, you can group that around other plants, and that will naturally raise the humidity around those plants that you've put in a group. Other things you can do is you can put it on a tray of pebbles that is half filled with water. As that water is evaporating, it will evaporate around the plants, causing a natural humid environment for it. Other things you can do is you can take shells, the kind of shells you get at the seaside, and you can put them around the top of the soil. And when you're watering the plant, they will keep reservoirs of water. So I would imagine you're probably going to end up watering this plant during the growing season once a week. And if you've got 4 or 5 shells in there, and you know, every time you're watering, you're filling those little reservoirs in the shells with water, that will create natural humidity around the plant as well. So they're just some extra ways for you to raise your humidity around the plant if you choose to do so. Although, as I mentioned earlier, if you don't have any of those options available to you with this plant, it's okay. You don't have to necessarily have a high humid environment. It will do just fine, providing you're providing it with adequate light and watering. So I think I've covered the humidity there in quite a lot of detail. I'm going to now move on to the temperature range to keep this plant in. So as I mentioned earlier, due to the fact that it comes from Central and South America, it lives in quite a warm environment. But the level of heat that you can keep it in as a fluctuation is quite a large one. So again, this plant, where temperature is concerned, is quite a forgiving plant. So you can actually be keeping this plant in temperatures during the growing season. If you want a prolific growth pattern from the plant, you want to keep it in a minimum of about 20 degrees Celsius up to about 28 degrees Celsius. Although saying that, I've had temperatures recently up to 38 degrees Celsius here in London, and the plant's been quite happy with it. Although it's not been extended, it's just been for a day or 2 days, and you know, generally being above 28 has not lasted more than a few days at a time. But from my research, this plant is suggested that for optimum growth patterns and the happiest possible plant that you can have, you want to keep it between 20 and 28 during the growing season, and that is a daytime temperature. And during the evening time, you can actually have this plant drop down as low as 13 degrees Celsius. So as I mentioned earlier, the fluctuation that you've got to work with is quite huge. So this is a great plant for beginners as well as experienced plant keepers. This is generally an all-round kind of plant. For any level of plant keeper, this is a good starting point, and good for your more experienced if you want to try and grow a mature plant with those 30-centimeter leaves, and you want to try and experiment getting higher variegation on there and so on and so forth. Is good for all levels of plant growing. So I think also one thing I will mention is this plant doesn't like drafts. So especially during the winter periods, you want to keep it away from a drafty place. In the summer, it's not going to matter so much, providing the heat is hot enough and humid enough. It's not going to cause any unnecessary damage to the plant. But particularly during the winter periods, or during periods where it starts dropping below 20 degrees during the day, you want to keep this away from any drafts, because it's going to end up damaging your plant, and you're going to end up, you know, with browning of the leaves, and it will start dropping leaves regularly. Its growth will slow down, and you know, it will turn into quite an unhappy plant. I think I've covered everything there as far as temperature is concerned. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move on to fertilizer. So fertilizing this plant is generally quite straightforward. With most of my plants, I use a general house plant fertilizer. Now with this plant, because it's such a prolific grower, what you want to actually do is you want to give it a 50% dilution rate compared to what it actually says on the bottle. I will never give the absolute dilution that the companies are suggesting. So if they're saying 10 mil to a litre, I will generally give 5 mil to a litre, just as an example. So whatever the dilution rate of the fertilizer that you're using, chop that in half, and you'll want to fertilize this about once a month. Because it grows so much, you're going to need to provide it with a regular source of nutrients. Also, I would suggest outside of the growing season, because this plant isn't the type of plant to stop growing, although it will slow growth, it will continue growing. I would suggest, and because it's such a lush plant, I would suggest to carry on fertilizing during the autumn and winter period as well. But what I would suggest during the autumn and winter period is to cut it down to once every 2 months, still at a 50% dilution rate. So during the winter period, once every 2 months, and just cut your watering back a little bit as well. So if you're watering during the growing season once every week, then you're probably going to end up watering during the winter period once every 2 to 3 weeks. And providing you stick to the idea that you're letting the soil dry up to 50% in between watering, then that should naturally just fall into place for you. So I think I've covered pretty much everything as far as fertilizing is concerned now. What we're going to do next is we're going to talk a little bit about the potting mix. Now, as I've mentioned again and again, because this is such a easygoing plant and suitable for all levels of plant enthusiasts out there, it's, as far as the potting mixes goes, it's quite an easy plant to keep happy. So you can use just a general house plant potting mix, mix a little bit of perlite into it and add some orchid bark mix if you have some. The orchid bark mix will just help to retain the nutrients that you're putting in when watering the plant. It will give it something to adhere itself to, a bigger surface area for it to stick to, instead of it draining out when you're watering and the excess water comes out the bottom. The more of the nutrient you get to keep in the pot, the better. So if you're just potting up and you're quite new to it, then a general house plant potting mix will be fine, and just add a little bit of perlite to the mix just to make sure that you're keeping a well oxygenated rooting system. So the perlite will actually keep a lot of air around the roots for you as well. So I don't think there's much more to talk about as far as the potting mix actually goes itself. So just a general house plant potting mix, add a little bit of perlite in there if you've got it. Make sure it's quite well draining, because I would suggest that for any plant. The last thing that you want to do is you want to leave a plant in a soggy environment where it's sitting with wet roots around it, because it's inevitably it's going to cause damage to the plant. Okay, I think what I'm going to do now, I've covered pretty much everything as far as the plant's requirements are concerned. I'm going to give a special little mention to the toxicity of this plant. Now, in some of my previous videos, I've highlighted when I've remembered to, when plants are actually toxic. And I think it's quite an important thing to do, because a lot of people, they will walk into a shop, they will see a plant and they'll think, oh, this plant is lovely, I would love to have this plant at home. And then they will go home and they'll put it in the place and they'll water it and it will grow and everything will be fine. And there's not really much need, therefore, to go into researching the plant. You'll only get people, I guess, like myself, who want to know the information about the plant, who are actually going to do the research. Now, this plant is actually toxic to humans and pets alike. Now, if you've got young children at home and they're generally quite hands-on with everything, then I would suggest keep this out of reach, because it is quite a toxic plant to have in the house. Just touching the leaves themselves isn't going to cause you any irritation or anything untoward. It actually takes some form of ingesting of the plant for that to happen. Now, it's the same with people as it is with your pets. So cats and dogs, I forgot to mention other pets in my previous videos, but birds, people keep a whole different array of the kind of pets at home. and this is toxic to generally all pets. So if you've got kids at home, the things to look out for if you get a bit worried and your child or your animals are showing any particular type of symptoms, then these are the things to be looking out for. It would include swelling of the lips and the tongue, also swelling of the throat. It can also cause stomach irritation, which can also induce vomiting. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it actually takes ingesting to actually have those symptoms happening, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be physically eating the leaf. Now, a child could take the leaf in their hand and scrunch up the leaf, and breaking the leaf will release fibers from within that leaf and the juices from within that leaf, and your child might end up putting their hands in their mouth an hour later or something like that, and it's enough to cause quite an amount of distress. And if you can imagine swelling of the tongue and swelling of the mouth and the esophagus and upset tummy and so on and so forth, these are quite serious things to keep an eye out for. So as I mentioned earlier, if you've got kids and they're looking like they're having any of these symptoms and you do happen to have a toxic plant at home, please do go and check over your plant. Give it a good scan over, make sure that there is nothing to suggest that your child or your pet has been in any way, shape or form actually playing with that plant, and then they've accidentally put their hands or in their mouth, or your pet has actually had a little nibble. Just to rule out these things, if you've got toxic plants in your house and you notice your kid's got an upset stomach, don't take the risk of just putting it down to an upset stomach. Go the extra mile. I'm sure you would as parents and pet keepers anyway, but I just want to make it very clear that definitely go the extra mile. Make sure that it's not due to them ingesting any part of that plant itself. So I think I've covered pretty much everything as far as the plant is concerned. If I've missed anything, then please, do let me know. If there's any questions you have and I haven't given answers to those questions during this video so far, then please leave that in the comments. I'm always very happy to read the comments, to get questions, to answer them. I actually get some very, very in-depth questions where I have to actually go away and do a whole lot more research, and I actually really, really enjoy those kind of questions. So whether it be big, small, whether you consider it to be significant or insignificant, to me it's all significant. The reason I'm producing these videos is for that purpose. So please don't feel embarrassed to ask me any kind of question whatsoever. I'm very happy always to answer those questions for you. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move on to propagation of the plant. So before I actually move on to the cuttings, I'm going to talk a little bit about propagating the plant through roots. So if you actually took this plant out of the pot and you took all the soil away, you'd find that it would have several different growth areas. So a plant this sort of size, you could probably divide into 5, maybe 6 different plants, and all you need to do is remove all the soil and then take where the growing stem is and the roots coming out and start dividing those growing stems with the roots into different plants. And that's pretty self-explanatory. You'll just then repot them into new potting medium, into their own pots, and that will produce, instead of having one large plant, you'll end up with a few smaller plants. But I think, like I mentioned, that's pretty self-explanatory itself. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to go through taking cuttings of the plant. Now these are actually considered to be leaf cuttings. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this branch here. This is my favorite branch on my plant. I'm actually going to butcher it today, which is, it's not a shame, but it does make me a little bit sad, because this plant here has several growth points growing off of it at the moment, but at the same time I'm not actually losing anything by taking those cuttings. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to leave it at this internode here, and I'm going to cut just below this internode. Now people, they often say cut your plants at like a 75-degree angle or 45 degree, I'm sure it's 75-degree angle, They say cut it at a slant. Now, I've taken so many cuttings over the years. Sometimes I'll cut them just straight, sometimes I'll cut them at a slant, but I don't seem to notice a huge amount of difference when I do take the cuttings either way. So don't feel as if you've done something wrong if you just go and cut it straight off and you're sitting there thinking to yourself, but I've been told by reviews I've read to cut it at an angle and so on and so forth. It will still root quite happily. There are other things that I've learned through taking cuttings as well that I will go into a little bit of detail about whilst we take these cuttings. So as I mentioned, what I'm going to do, I'm going to leave this internode here and I'm going to actually cut it from here. So I'm just going to remove this here, so I'm cutting that off, and what I'm actually left with now is this part of the plant. And what you actually want to do is you want to follow the growth of the plant so that you know the direction that the leaves are growing in, so that you can plant the part that you want to root being the most bottom part of the cutting, because that is the easiest place to root it from. So just as an example, if you took this cutting here and then you cut below the internode and you put the plant in on this side, it would struggle to root compared to if you put it on this side, because it's growing downward. The roots would produce easier from that downward space. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to cut this into 3 different sections, because I think I've got 3 different growths on here. So that's 1. Here's another one here. That's 2. And I believe that's the 3rd one. Yep, so we've got 3 separate parts for cuttings there. What I'm going to do, I'm going to go over each one and I'm going to show you how to take a leaf cutting. Now generally what you'll find with these is in between the internodes you'll have a single leaf, and what you want to do is you want to trim a couple of centimeters away from the internode from the top part, so just like that, and that bit can be chucked away, and then you want to trim a couple of centimeters below the internode, so you're going to end up with a cutting that looks like that. Okay, so you've got a couple of centimeters above the internode, a couple of centimeters below the internode. I'm going to move my little water container up here. I know it's not the ideal one, I just grabbed whatever was close to hand and we're just going to work with this. So then what you want to do, you want to put that into the water. I generally will water propagate all of my cuttings and usually give them about 3 weeks worth of rooting before I start thinking about potting them up. So again, I've got the space cut here. This plant smells so lovely when you actually take the cuttings. It's got such a like freshly cut grass smell to it, which is it might not seem strange to you, but I take so many cuttings, it's not a smell that I'm familiar smelling from a cutting. So again, same thing. All you're going to do, you're going to cut a couple of centimeters below the internode, so you've got a cutting like that, and then just take that cutting, plunk it straight into the water, and then remove a bit of the stem that's left over, and then take a cutting again a few centimeters down and take that cutting, stick it straight into the water, and again take a few centimeters away from that stem, and then underneath the node, so you've got the node here where the leaf is actually growing out from, that's called your node, and you want to have a couple of centimeters above the node and a couple of centimeters below the node. So just like that, and then you stick that straight into the water, and then gradually you're just going to work your way around the plant like I've been doing. So again, take your cutting there, chop off a little bit of the excess just so you're leaving a couple of centimeters, put that straight into the water. And what you'll find with these plants is generally within sort of a week to 10 days they'll start showing signs of rooting, but you want to probably leave them for about 3 weeks to produce a good root system before you think about starting to repot them in soil. Although at the same time, you don't have to water propagate these, you can just stick them straight into a pot from these cuttings that I'm producing and they will root quite happily. The only reason I like to water propagate is because I can keep an eye on how the roots are being grown and how well it's doing, and notice if there's any that are not rooting, I can take them out before they start rotting in amongst the other plants. So just again here, just taking a cutting a couple of centimeters above and below the leaf, so you've got your node and you've got a good place for the roots to start growing. And what I'm actually going to do now is I'm going to show you a little trick that I know also to add to your cuttings. Now, I won't generally do this with these cuttings, but I'm just going to show you just for your own referencing, because it will actually help your roots grow a lot quicker. So what you want to do is you want to find the part that you're going to be rooting from. So for instance, this part of the stem here, and what you want to do, you want to put little slits into the stem. So put 4 slits around the circumference of it, not going through. So you only want to go about 1/4 of the depth into the stem, and do that in 4 separate places around there. And what that will actually do, not only will it root from the bottom now, it will root from those 4 slits that you've put in the plant. So you'll actually end up with a lot healthier rooting system growing from the plant. I'm not going to sit here and do that with every single one, because it's going to be quite time consuming, and obviously I want to fit as much of these cuttings into the video as possible. I'm going to stick this one, because it's got a new leaf growing in there. I'm going to stick this one straight into the pot as it is. So I'm just going to tip that off. I'm going to put some slits in this one because it's got extra growth on it. So instead of chopping the extra growth off, I want to give it a chance to produce extra roots. That's also a good thing to keep in mind when you've got a plant with significant growth and you don't want to lose all of that growth, and you're taking cuttings, just add slits to the part where you're actually hoping the plant will root, and that gives it extra space where it will actually produce those roots for you. So instead of having one place where it's rooting from, it'll end up with 5 places, so the 4 cuts and the bottom where you actually snipped it away. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to carry on with this here, and like I said, always try and follow the growth the way that it's growing. So cutting downwards, putting the bottom part as the rooting part, so cutting here, and then being that this is the bottom part, this is the part that you want to focus mainly going into the water, although you might find that both parts of that actually will end up in the water. And then same again, just take your cutting off, removing excess stem. My stem's getting quite thick here, and take that cutting there. It's quite an insignificant cutting actually, the leaf on there is quite tiny, so I'm not sure if that one will take, but we'll give it a try anyway. And then another cutting here, and snip some of the excess off from here. You'll always know where the bottom is, because the bottom is going to be the most recent cut that you're making, and the top where its oldest growth is going to be where you snipped previously. So you're always going to end up with a longer piece on the previous snip. So again, taking a couple of centimeters off, just taking that cutting along there. Let's remove that bit off of there, and that goes straight into the water there like so. Basically you're just going to repeat this process all the way around the plant until you finish doing your cuttings. I'm not going to carry on, I'll do the rest of it off a video, because I think I've given you the general idea how to do that. I'll do one more just so I can go over it in as much detail as I can, but then after that I'm going to get ready to end the video. Okay, so what you do, you snip away from the top, snip a couple of centimeters from the bottom, and just to go over what I'd mentioned earlier again, what you can do is you can put 4 slits around the circumference of the stem, so going around like so, 4 slits around the circumference. Now when you're doing this, make sure you don't stick your fingers in your mouth afterwards. Make sure you go and wash your hands, because you have got, you know, the plant now on your fingers, and as I mentioned earlier, it is a toxic plant. So then you just put them in the water and wait for them to propagate. As I mentioned earlier, you can actually propagate this directly into soil. The only reason I like to do it in water propagation is so that I can keep an eye on how they're rooting and which ones are taking well and which ones are not, so I can remove the ones that are going to struggle, because